Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The Goblet of Fire is a turning point. It became the bridge between the bright, almost childlike tone of the first three books and the darker, more adult reality of the following ones. It was here that Voldemort returned. It was here, for the first time in Harry Potter history, that a Hogwarts student died, and all of this unfolded against the backdrop of the Triwizard tournament, a spectacular but incredibly dangerous competition. Many still see the tournament as an exciting plot device, but behind it lies a collection of little-known and deeply troubling details. Today I'll take you through the history of this competition and explain why the tournament, despite all its grandeur, became a symbol of recklessness. Enjoy the video. Number 1. In 1994, they decided to restart the tournament. Dumbledore mentioned that for centuries, many attempts had been made to revive the tournament, all unsuccessful. Yet in 1994, powerful figures in the magical world suddenly decided it was the right time to bring it back. But was it really? Just a year earlier, Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, throwing the wizarding community into panic. Then in the summer of 1994, the Quidditch World Cup ended in horror, a Death Eater attack and the dark mark over the camp. And amidst all this, someone thought it was a great idea to host a life-threatening competition for students. Yes, there were new restrictions. Only students over 17 could participate, and the Goblet of Fire would bind chosen champions with an unbreakable magical contract. But Dumbledore himself admitted the tournament would be dangerous. Children were told in plain words, "You cannot refuse, even if you realize you might die." Number 2. There are many questions about this tournament. The 1994 tournament became arguably the most scandalous in its entire history. The Goblet of Fire chose a fourth champion, Harry Potter. He didn't submit his name, he wasn't even eligible. But due to the contract, Dumbledore claimed he couldn't withdraw him. This alone raises confusion. Who exactly did the goblet bind? The one who tampered with it? The person whose name was drawn? Where's the logic? Instead of investigating and protecting a student, the adult wizards allowed a 14-year-old boy to take part in deadly trials meant for senior students. In every task, Harry faced real danger, fighting a dragon, diving into a freezing lake, navigating a maze full of magical traps. Even more disturbing was the tournament's moral aspect. The organizers kidnapped the champions' loved ones to make the second task more interesting. Just think, the friends and family of children were used as living props. The tournament's senseless cruelty peaked with Cedric Diggory's death. He didn't lose, he didn't make a mistake, he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. A competition meant to symbolize friendship turned into a killing ground. Number 3. What is the Triwizard Tournament? The tournament was founded about 700 years ago as a friendly competition between Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. The exact date is unclear, but according to Dumbledore, the first tournament took place sometime between 1200 and 1300. Its goal was noble, to strengthen ties between magical schools. Every 5 years, 3 champions would compete in 3 tasks to determine who was the smartest, bravest, and strongest. But behind the facade of camaraderie lurked great dangers. The challenges often resulted in injuries and even deaths. Still, the tournament continued for centuries until something happened that brought it to a sudden end. Number 4. What happened at the 1792 tournament? It was the 1792 incident that finally broke the camel's back. That year, the champions were tasked with capturing a cockatrice, a magical creature resembling a rooster with a lizard's tail. But the beast got out of control. The judges had to intervene and were injured themselves. There was chaos, there was fear, there was panic. Students had died in past tournaments, but the cockatrice incident, which directly harmed the judges, became the final straw. After that, the schools unanimously decided the tournament must be cancelled. For the next 2 centuries, no one dared bring it back. The cost had been too high. But as we know, in 1994, the past came knocking on Hogwarts' door once more. Number 5. Who designed the tasks of the 1994 tournament? The tasks weren't born from tradition. They were designed by a committee, one that included school heads and ministry officials who seemed more concerned with spectacle than safety. Dragons, mermaids, a shifting maze full of curses. They called it competition. But it felt more like survival. Charlie Weasley brought in the dragons from Romania. He called them majestic. The Hungarian horntail nearly killed Harry. "You're to get past it," said Moody. That was the only instruction. No safety net, no second chance. The lake challenge was worse. The mer people of the Black Lake agreed to help, not for payment but for sport. They waited below with sharp spears and no smiles. And the final task? A maze built by Professor Sprout and Hagrid, filled with traps and monsters. It was overseen by Barty Crouch Sr., who by then was under the imperious curse. No one checked, no one noticed. Inside the maze, the champions walked blindly into danger, guided by adults who had already lost control. Number 6. How were the hostages for the second task chosen? The hostages for the second task were never asked. They were taken. Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley, Cho Chang, and Gabrielle Delacour all woke up underwater, bound and bewitched. No warning, no consent, no letters home. The judges decided who each champion cared about most, and the champions were never even consulted. It wasn't about love or trust. It was about spectacle. "You have 1 hour to recover what was taken," the mermaid song warned. What was taken, not what volunteered. Ron floated beneath the water like a statue. Harry found him pale, unmoving. "They've been down here too long," he whispered in panic. The book described their condition with eerie calm, deeply asleep, enchanted, unmoving. But what if no one had come for them? What if the spell broke late? The champions were children. What if they'd failed? Gabrielle Delacour was only 8. She couldn't swim, couldn't defend herself. Her life hung on whether Fleur could escape Grindylows. The second task wasn't a test of magical skill. It was a test of moral gamble. The judges risked lives to see what choices the champions would make. They let children float alone beneath a frozen lake, guarded by merpeople who didn't always follow rules. And when it was over, no one asked the hostages how they felt, because they were never the real focus. They were just props in a dangerous game. Number 7. Why did the Goblet accept Harry's entry? The Goblet of Fire wasn't clever, it wasn't wise, it was enchanted wood and ancient spells built to recognize names and bind champions by magic. When Barty Crouch Jr. slipped Harry's name into the goblet, the trap was already set. He didn't list Hogwarts. He wrote in a fake 4th school. The Goblet, confused, believed it was a 4th institution and treated Harry as the only applicant. A loophole, a trick, and it worked. The moment Harry's name burst from the flames, the room froze. "Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry?" Dumbledore asked him. And though the movie version showed rage, the book was calm. Harry said no. No one believed him. But the magic of the goblet didn't lie. It bound him. That piece of parchment, that false entry, created an unbreakable contract. Not even Dumbledore could undo it. No one had thought to enchant the goblet against fraud. No one tested for magical interference. No one imagined that a student's name could be entered without their knowledge. It was negligence hidden behind centuries of tradition. They trusted an object more than their own judgment. And Harry paid the price. The goblet was just fire and spellwork. It had no heart, no sense of right or wrong. In the end, it crowned Harry a champion, not because he was chosen, but because no one guarded against being tricked. A child's life was sacrificed to bureaucracy and blind faith in magic. Number 8. The secret role of Barty Crouch Jr. The real Mad-Eye Moody was trapped in a magical trunk. For almost a year, no one knew. In his place stood Barty Crouch Jr., one of Voldemort's most devoted followers, drinking Polyjuice Potion daily, playing the part of a paranoid ex-aura. "Constant vigilance," he barked, in every class, and no one ever guessed the truth. He didn't just impersonate Moody. He directed the entire tournament like a hidden conductor. He whispered suggestions into Harry's ear, always disguised as advice. "Play to your strengths," he told him, before the dragon task, guiding Harry to summon his firebolt. It worked. Then he had Dobby bring Harry gillyweed for the lake, an idea he made sure Dobby overheard. Every step was carefully laid, every obstacle prearranged. His goal was never the cup, it was the graveyard. The cup had been turned into a portkey by his own hand. He needed Harry to reach it first, no matter what. And so the maze was twisted, the tasks slanted, the judges distracted. "You have been taught how to think," he praised Harry, hiding his manipulation behind flattery. It wasn't about fairness, it was about delivery. What's terrifying isn't just what Barty did, it's how easily he did it. Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, none of them saw through the disguise. A Death Eater stood in their halls, taught their students, ran their tournament, and no one noticed. The Triwizard tournament didn't just test students, it exposed just how blind the adults had become. Number 9. Why was the tournament not cancelled after Cedric's death? Cedric Diggory was dead. The crowd screamed when Harry returned with his body, but the banners didn't fall, the judges didn't speak, and the tournament continued. That night should have ended everything, but it didn't. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, arrived within minutes and chose denial over truth. "He's just a boy, Dumbledore," he snapped. "He's disturbed. Not Voldemort's return, not murder, just a boy with wild stories." Calling off the tournament would have meant accepting responsibility. It would have forced the ministry to admit they let a student die. Fudge couldn't allow that. He feared panic, feared headlines, so instead they gave Harry the cup. "We must go through the motions," Fudge insisted, as if a trophy could silence the grave. Harry stood there, numb, his hands still shaking. He was murdered, he told anyone who would listen. But they didn't want to listen. Rita Skeeter wrote stories filled with lies. Parents were told it was an accident, a tragedy, yes, but nothing more. No inquiry, no apology, just flowers laid quietly near Cedric's grave. The tournament ended with applause from those too afraid to face the truth. And for Harry, that final ceremony was worse than the graveyard, because even in death, Cedric's name was used to keep up appearances. The cup became a symbol, not of victory, but of silence. Number 10. What happened to the tournament afterwards? The Triwizard tournament ended in screams. Cedric Diggory's body lay cold on the grass, and Harry Potter clutched the cup that brought them both to death. After that night in 1994, the tournament vanished as quickly as it had returned. No official announcement, no ministry statement, just silence, the kind of silence that follows guilt. Behind the closed doors of the Department of Magical Games and Sports, debates raged. Some, like Ludo Bagman, wanted the tournament revived after the war. "It just needs better safeguards," he insisted. But others remembered the grave under the white stone at Hogwarts, the one that read Cedric Diggory, a true Hufflepuff. Dumbledore's words echoed in every room. Cedric was murdered by Lord Voldemort. There was no way to separate the tournament from that truth. In meetings between the heads of Hogwarts, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, the answer was clear. No more champions, no more dragons, no more hostages at the bottom of a lake. Madame Maxime refused to send another student. Igor Karkaroff was already dead. Even McGonagall, now headmistress, turned her back on the idea. "We honor Cedric by never repeating our mistakes," she said. The tournament, once a symbol of magical unity, became a cautionary tale, a page in the history books, some dream of bringing it back, reimagined and safe. but the shadow of the cup lingers. And until the wizarding world truly learns that no glory is worth the blood of a child, the Triwizard tournament will remain where it belongs, buried with its victims. Number 11. Why did Fleur Delacour struggle with the tasks? Fleur Delacour was the pride of Beauxbatons. Beautiful, graceful, chosen as champion among dozens. But as the Triwizard tournament unfolded, her victories never came. Many called her weak. Some said she didn't care enough, but the truth, as always, hid in the details that others overlooked. During the second task, Fleur dove into the Black Lake, determined to save her sister Gabrielle. The cold water closed in, and the cries of the merpeople echoed around her. She swam deep, but they attacked her with claws and sharp shrieks. "They do not understand mercy," Dumbledore once said of the merpeople. Caught in a tangle of thick weeds, Fleur fought desperately. The watchers above saw only her failure to finish the task. What they didn't see was how close Gabrielle came to drowning, until Harry broke the rules and rescued her. Fleur's tearful hug and whispered merci said everything. In the third task, she barely had a chance. The maze was alive, crawling with curses and illusions. Fleur entered it with her wand raised, but she was ambushed. She screamed, just once. By the time help arrived, she was unconscious. It was Victor Krum who attacked her under the Imperious Curse, cast by Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Moody. "He's not acting like himself," Hermione had noticed earlier, but no one listened. Fleur wasn't outwitted, she was sabotaged. Her failure was never hers alone. The tournament was never fair. Fleur Delacour wasn't a coward. She was a victim of a game rigged by dark magic and adult negligence. Behind the glittering ceremony stood shadows no champion could escape. Number 12, Victor Krum. What set him apart from the other champions? Victor Krum entered the Great Hall not with the pride of a Quidditch legend, but with the brooding silence of a man already burdened. His reputation preceded him. Seeker for the Bulgarian national team at just 18, a celebrity among young witches and wizards. When his name erupted from the Goblet of Fire as Durmstrang's champion, the room did not gasp. It nodded. Of course it was Krum. Who else could it be? But beneath the silent nods and the reverent glances a darker truth followed him, one that few dared to recognize. Victor Krum was not ready. Not for this tournament, not for the weight it demanded, and certainly not for the humanity it slowly ground out of its champions. There was a detachment about Victor that many mistook for arrogance. He wandered Hogwarts alone, even among his Durmstrang peers. Where others whispered excitedly in corridors, Krum trudged in silence, his heavy brow knitted in permanent contemplation. He kept his speech short, his gestures restrained. He did not seek friends, he did not seek approval. This reserve had little to do with ego and everything to do with upbringing. Durmstrang Institute bred warriors, not comrades. It tolerated the dark arts, celebrated strength, and dismissed weakness. And Victor, though young, had internalized these values with a frightening efficiency. The first task did not allow subtlety. Faced with a dragon, the Chinese fireball, Victor reverted to what Durmstrang had taught him best: attack. His solution was direct, even brutal. Instead of charming the dragon or outmaneuvering it with finesse, he blasted its eyes. He used a conjunctivitis curse, observers murmured, half admiring, half horrified. The fireball thrashed in agony, nearly flattening the stadium. Krum retrieved the golden egg, but at a cost. The judges offered him high marks, but the crowd's applause was uneasy. He had won, yes, but he had not enchanted. What made Victor different was that he never truly seemed to want to win. Unlike Harry, who was forced into the tournament, or Cedric, who bore the quiet honor of Hufflepuff, or Fleur, who carried the expectations of Beauxbatons' grace and charm, Victor moved through each task like a soldier fulfilling a duty. He was not in awe of the spectacle. He was not in love with the fame. If anything, the tournament seemed to bore him or worse, sicken him. Perhaps because he had already lived under the weight of public expectation. In Quidditch, his body served a nation. In the tournament, it served a myth. The second task revealed more of Victor than he intended. As the champions dived into the Black Lake, the magical world held its breath. What would the Quidditch prodigy do underwater? Would he soar through currents as effortlessly as he flew through clouds? Instead, Krum emerged with a half-formed shark's head, the result of a flawed but ambitious transfiguration. It was grotesque, but it worked. He reached Hermione, his hostage, and clawed her free. The choice was telling. The girl he barely spoke to in public had become his most valued person, and when he saw the others still submerged, he hesitated. He tried to take another, Gabrielle, Fleur's sister, despite the rules. Krum used transfiguration, Dumbledore later remarked, impressed, though not pleased. An unusual choice. But Victor's instinct wasn't toward innovation, it was toward force. His shark form was a declaration of his mentality. Become the predator, not the rescuer. Tear through the water, rip through the problem, take what matters and escape. He did not understand that this task measured compassion as much as skill. He was playing a different game. In the days between tasks, he shadowed Hermione like a phantom. Where she walked, he lingered nearby. At first, people snickered. Why would a star like Krum fall for a bookish girl like Granger? But there was no jest in his gaze. He watched her with a solemnity that frightened her, as though he were trying to memorize the softness of someone unlike the world he knew. Durmstrang had not prepared him for gentleness, and yet here it was, in the shape of a muggle-born with frizzy hair and too many opinions. She made him stumble, not in words, but in thought. Ron Weasley was furious, of course, but Victor never retaliated. He didn't challenge, didn't protest. He simply watched. When he invited Hermione to the Yule Ball, it wasn't with pomp or pride, but with hesitant sincerity, and when they danced, there was a grace to him the audience had never seen on a broom. Hermo-Ninny, he called her, mispronouncing with an endearment that betrayed his vulnerability. He was trying, but love, real, awkward love, wasn't a subject they taught at Durmstrang. By the time the third task arrived, Victor had already begun to fray. The labyrinth was not just a physical test, it was psychological warfare. It twisted the champions against themselves, drew out their fears, and, in Krum's case, stripped away the thin layer of restraint he had left. Under the imperious curse, placed by the false Moody, Victor turned on Fleur. The details were never made public, but whispers suggested it wasn't just a hex. He attacked her violently, mind-controlled or not. When Harry and Cedric encountered him, his eyes were blank, his wand raised. The tournament had finally broken through the last of his defenses. Yet no one disqualified him. No one questioned the fairness of what had happened. Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Alastor Moody, had manipulated the entire maze. The organizers, desperate to maintain order, swept Victor's aggression under the rug. They whispered of curses, of sabotage, of extenuating circumstances, but the truth remained. Victor Krum had become a weapon, and once you unleash a weapon, it rarely goes back in its sheath. Number 13, the portkey cup. How did Voldemort trick everyone? The Triwizard tournament was meant to be a celebration of magical unity, a grand event resurrected after a long and dangerous dormancy. Instead, it became one of the greatest security failures in the modern history of the wizarding world. The turning point wasn't a dragon, a mermaid, or a labyrinth. It was a gleaming silver cup, standing in the center of a maze, glowing faintly with enchantments, far more dangerous than anyone suspected. It stood as the prize, the finish line, the symbol of triumph. Yet it was that very cup that betrayed every adult in Hogwarts, every enchantment placed on the grounds, and every supposed precaution set in place. The Triwizard Cup, in the end, wasn't a trophy. It was a trap. And Lord Voldemort had set it himself using the hands of another. The transformation of the cup into a portkey was not just a clever magical trick. It was a brutal indictment of the negligence that surrounded the tournament from the very beginning. To turn any object into a portkey requires precise magic and a moment of physical contact. To turn the ultimate object of the tournament, the one the champions would inevitably touch, into such a portkey was a stroke of criminal genius. The enchantment itself was simple. The access to the cup was the real problem, but that access was gifted directly into Voldemort's grasp through one man, Barty Crouch Jr., hidden in plain sight, impersonating Mad-Eye Moody. Barty Crouch Jr.'s infiltration into Hogwarts staff was itself a failure of immeasurable proportions. No one, neither Dumbledore nor Snape nor the Ministry, saw through the disguise. Using polyjuice potions stolen from Snape's private stores and a captive real Moody locked in a magical trunk, Crouch moved freely through Hogwarts. He manipulated events, charmed objects, and subtly controlled Harry's path toward the cup. He orchestrated every step of the maze, and no one asked the right questions. No one thought to examine the cup. Why would they? It had been the end point all along, the shining reward awaiting at the heart of the maze. That trust became their ruin. When Harry and Cedric reached the cup together, they made a decision born of camaraderie and fairness to seize it as one. "Both of us," Harry said. "We'll take it together." It should have been a moment of pure, golden sportsmanship. Instead, it was the moment Voldemort had waited for. The cup flared, a hook yanked them forward, and they vanished from the maze, from the arena, from all protection. They landed in the graveyard of Little Hangleton. The victory had become a kidnapping. That a portkey was placed under everyone's noses, under Dumbledore's nose, begs a haunting question. Who exactly was watching the cup? One would expect that the central magical object of the entire tournament would have been inspected and protected. Yet, astonishingly, no such inspection occurred. Dumbledore, brilliant as he was, seemed to believe that Moody, who was not Moody, had the situation under control. The Triwizard tournament, fraught with danger already, was built on layers of trust in the champions, the judges, the spectators, and the integrity of the object at the finish line. But trust, when blind, is not virtue. It is vulnerability. The maze was surrounded by judges and professors. Every inch of it was supposedly safeguarded by magic to ensure that the champions would not be killed or injured. But how could they all fail to notice the most dangerous magical alteration of all? The cup glowed with enchantment, but no one thought to determine what that enchantment was. It is known that Dumbledore, McGonagall, and even Barty Crouch Sr. were present during the final task, yet none of them seemed aware that their own sons and students were being led into a trap. From the very beginning of the year, Barty Crouch Jr. manipulated Harry's fate. He placed his name in the Goblet of Fire, a magical act that should have been impossible for someone underage. He ensured Harry's name was chosen. He subtly advised Harry, coached him through challenges, provided him with gillyweed, directed him toward the dragons, and ultimately nudged him through the maze. "Play to his strengths," he had whispered in Dumbledore's ear, disguising his true motives behind concern. No one saw through it. No one questioned why Moody seemed so invested in Harry's success. The irony is grotesque. The object of glory, the cup itself, became the tool of slaughter. Cedric Diggory, brave and honourable, died instantly. "Kill the spare," Voldemort ordered. With those 3 words, the tournament became a tomb. Cedric's body fell among the gravestones, discarded like trash. Harry, paralysed with horror, became the centrepiece of a resurrection. His blood was used to restore Voldemort's form. The cup that brought them there gleamed in the grass, forgotten. Not a trophy, a weapon. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the scene is terrifying in its clarity. He felt his feet slam into the ground. His wand flew out of his hand. He fell forward onto the grass. That instant, that violent pull through space, was not part of the tournament. It was not an accident, it was design. Every detail had been arranged to place Harry there at that time before a cauldron waiting to be filled with his blood. No professor could have suspected Barty Crouch Jr. because no one believed he was alive. The Ministry had declared him dead in Azkaban. That assumption alone left a gaping blind spot in Hogwarts security. It allowed a known Death Eater to live among the children, to manipulate their education, to plan a murder. That Hogwarts' own staff could be so deeply deceived raises dark questions about the complacency that had set in after Voldemort's fall. Perhaps they believed the war was truly over, but Barty Crouch Jr. proved them all wrong. Number 14. Why weren't the remaining tasks cancelled after the incidents? Of all the events that unfolded during Harry Potter's 4th year at Hogwarts, the most shocking was not merely the tragedy of Cedric Diggory's death, it was the persistent decision to press on, to continue the Triwizard tournament even after the warning signs had grown too loud to ignore. At each stage, the tournament betrayed its own design. Intended to be a friendly contest between schools, it instead became a chilling reflection of how the magical world chose prestige and appearances over protection and prudence. Each task, increasingly reckless and morally fraught, screamed for intervention. Yet the tournament was never called off. The first task, designed to test courage and nerve, required each champion to steal a golden egg guarded by a dragon. It was dangerous by design, but the risk escalated beyond intention when the Hungarian horntail assigned to Harry broke free from its bindings. It wasn't just that the creature chased Harry across the arena, its fire came dangerously close to the spectator stands. The book notes, the crowd gasped as the dragon's tail smashed into the stands. A shower of splinters fell on the spectators. Had Harry not lured the dragon away into the skies, dozens might have been injured. Yet this glaring misstep was downplayed. The public, thrilled by the drama, clapped and cheered. The Ministry took it as a sign of success, never mind that the beast nearly incinerated a crowd of children and their families. Even within the Hogwarts staff, concern was palpable. Professor McGonagall, fiercely protective of her students, voiced her worries. Though the books do not record her direct protests against the tournament, her demeanour suggested disapproval. She repeatedly tried to shield Harry from unnecessary risk, as when she attempted to remove him from the Yule Ball preparations out of concern for his time and mental state. Her silence regarding the dragon incident felt less like agreement and more like powerlessness. Behind the scenes, it was clear, whatever control the Hogwarts staff believed they had, the tournament's fate had already been hijacked by a larger political agenda. The second task was more insidious in its threat. Champions were told their most precious thing had been taken and hidden underwater in the Black Lake. What they weren't told was that this thing was a person. Friends and loved ones were suspended under a magical sleep, tied to the lake bed among the merpeople. They were tied tightly to the tail of the statue, the book reads, describing Hermione, Ron, Fleur's sister Gabrielle, and Cho Chang. The implication was grotesque. Fail, and your hostage might drown. How had this been deemed acceptable? As Harry surfaced with both Ron and Gabrielle in tow, fearing the worst, he was told his concern was unnecessary. Dumbledore laughed gently, saying, "The hostages have never been in real danger." But the line rings hollow. How could Dumbledore guarantee that, especially when Fleur had failed to reach her sister? Her panic had been real. And what of the merpeople? Fierce, territorial, and not known for their mercy, they might have enforced the time limit with more aggression than Dumbledore expected. The tournament officials brushed it off as an overreaction. Yet to any observer with sense, it was becoming evident. The safety of students was not a priority, it was an afterthought. By the time the third task arrived, the illusion of safety was entirely gone. The maze, supposedly the final trial of wit and strength, was transformed into a near-death gauntlet. Magical creatures, enchantments, and twisted paths awaited the champions, and once inside, no external contact was possible. The maze is patrolled, they were told, but even the patrolling professors and aurors had no idea what was about to happen, because this time the danger wasn't part of the plan. It was something darker, older, more sinister. Lord Voldemort's return. When Harry and Cedric touched the Triwizard Cup together, they were transported to the graveyard of Little Hangleton. There, Cedric was murdered within seconds. "Kill the spare," said Voldemort's voice, and Peter Pettigrew obeyed. The curse hit Cedric squarely in the chest. He died instantly. It was the moment that should have ended the tournament. Instead, when Harry returned with Cedric's body, he was met with confusion, suspicion, and political denial. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, refused to believe Voldemort had returned and dismissed Harry's account. Cedric's death was labelled a tragic accident. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire ordeal. No official statement was made about cancelling the tournament, no public inquiry into how the cup had been turned into a portkey, no investigation into how a Death Eater had managed to infiltrate Hogwarts under the guise of Alastor Moody for an entire year. Instead, the Ministry sought to silence the witnesses. Fudge's denial was absolute. The tournament, a project of international cooperation, was too valuable to be tainted by a scandal. Behind this silence was something deeper than bureaucracy. It was pride, specifically the pride of powerful adults unwilling to admit they had endangered children for spectacle. The tournament was not just a Hogwarts event. Beauxbaton and Durmstrang had travelled from afar to take part. Cancelling it would be an embarrassment to the Ministry, a signal of failure, and so they pressed forward, minimising each catastrophe, hoping no one would look too closely. Albus Dumbledore, despite his influence, found himself cornered. His authority within Hogwarts did not extend over the international agreements surrounding the tournament. In Goblet of Fire, he is quoted saying, "You have a right to know everything," when addressing Harry after the graveyard incident. It is a telling phrase. He, too, was kept in the dark. The Ministry didn't want knowledge, they wanted control. Dumbledore tried to speak out, but was met with resistance. His warnings about Voldemort were labelled hysteria. Even within Hogwarts, staff were discouraged from speaking publicly. The facade had to be maintained. Number 15, the tournament as a reflection of the magical society. The Triwizard Tournament of 1994 was meant to be a symbol of international magical cooperation, a dazzling event showcasing the talents of young witches and wizards. But beneath the polished veneer of golden goblets and cheering crowds, the tournament served a far more revealing function. It mirrored the deep flaws, fears, and fragility of the magical world. Those who watched saw a competition, those who understood saw a warning, and in the glittering halls of Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic found the perfect place to stage its illusion of control while turning its back on the gathering darkness. Barty Crouch Sr., once a man of steel resolve and unyielding law, stood as the perfect emblem of a ministry obsessed with appearance. His presence at Hogwarts during the tournament was meant to convey confidence and order, but in truth it masked deep internal decay. The same man who had once fought Death Eaters with brutal efficiency was now so blinded by bureaucracy and personal shame that he failed to notice his own son impersonating a professor under his nose. "You are forgetting the crucial factor, who put your name in the Goblet of Fire?" Dumbledore asked Harry. But perhaps that question should have been directed at the very system that allowed such a thing to happen. Albus Dumbledore, revered and wise, was not immune to the faults of the time. Despite his intellect and caution, he invited disaster into his school. He agreed to the tournament's return under the premise of building unity, a noble goal, but the execution proved naive. 3 schools were brought together, but suspicion, rivalry, and cultural snobbery prevailed. The French delegation, led by Madame Maxime, was treated as exotic and aloof. The Durmstrang group, headed by Igor Karkaroff, carried the taint of old allegiances and unspoken guilt. Even within Hogwarts, house divisions deepened as support for champions became tribal. Unity was preached, but division was what the students learned. The Goblet of Fire, enchanted to be an impartial judge, became the unwitting tool of manipulation. Its judgment was law even when corrupted. No adult, not even the greatest minds of the age, could challenge its word. When Harry Potter's name emerged, the world bent to the will of a cursed flame, revealing how the magical society had placed blind faith in magical artifacts without accountability. The goblet was sacred, and so the lie had to be real. This, more than anything, symbolized the society's dependence on tradition at the expense of truth. Harry himself became the scapegoat of a system that needed a villain more than it wanted clarity. Accused of seeking glory, he bore the hatred of his peers and the skepticism of his mentors. The public and press, through Rita Skeeter's venomous quill, turned a child into a manipulator and a cheat. "I've been writing about the Triwizard tournament for months," she bragged, "and the only story anyone cares about is you." The society that had once worshipped Harry as the boy who lived now devoured him as a spectacle. The media, not facts, shaped reality. What mattered was the narrative, not the truth. Meanwhile, Cedric Diggory became the symbol of everything the system wanted to protect. Noble, talented, handsome, and perfectly Hogwarts. But Cedric was more than a pretty face. He was a decent soul caught in a game designed by men who had forgotten decency. His death was not an accident, nor a twist of fate. It was the inevitable consequence of a society that demanded entertainment and ignored consequence. "Kill the spare," Voldemort said coldly, and with those 3 words, the magical world's dream collapsed into a nightmare it could no longer deny. The tasks of the tournament, meant to test bravery, intelligence, and magical skill, quickly devolved into survival challenges where death was only narrowly avoided. The dragons were the least dangerous of the 3 trials. The Black Lake revealed a willingness to manipulate fears, subjecting students to terrifying hallucinations underwater with little regard for their mental scars. The third task, with its shifting maze and hidden monsters, became a twisted metaphor for the confusion and moral blindness of the age. Each champion wandered alone, not toward victory, but toward a grave. Ludo Bagman, another ministry figure meant to represent charm and engagement, played his own part in the farce. Always smiling, always betting, he personified the magical society's addiction to spectacle and denial. As long as there were fireworks and headlines, no one needed to ask what lay in the shadows. Bagman's behavior, frivolous, evasive, and deeply irresponsible, was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. The ministry, like Bagman, was more concerned with distraction than defense. The Triwizard tournament was supposed to bring safety with rules, boundaries, and magical contracts, but even with every safeguard in place, a Death Eater infiltrated the heart of Hogwarts, took a child's life, and used the oldest magic of all, blood, to resurrect a monster. Voldemort's return was not the result of cunning, it was the result of complacency. The magical world had fallen asleep at the wheel, lulled by its own propaganda. And when it awoke, Cedric was dead. Fleur Delacour and Victor Krum, while given less narrative attention, were also pawns in this dangerous charade. Fleur, mocked for her femininity and accent, was rarely taken seriously by the Hogwarts crowd. Victor, shadowed by Karkaroff's past and his own status as a Quidditch star, was treated as both a threat and an outsider. Neither was truly embraced, despite the alleged purpose of the event. The tournament did not bridge cultures. It emphasized divisions and painted difference as danger. Professor Moody, or rather Barty Crouch Jr., was a grotesque symbol of how deeply the system had failed. Disguised with polyjuice potion and operating under the nose of the headmaster, he manipulated events from the inside. That he succeeded so completely was not just a testament to his cunning, but to the magical world's blindness. No one questioned why the new Moody was so eager to see Harry win. No one noticed his warped teaching methods. No one stopped him until it was too late. The students, those meant to learn and grow, became fodder in a game designed for adult pride. The magical community accepted this, perhaps because it had forgotten the value of youth. The older generation saw the tournament as nostalgic, a revival of the good old days. But for the younger generation, it was a battlefield. No one asked if they wanted to fight. They were told to play, and when the game turned deadly, applause still echoed in the stands. Behind every robe and wand was fear. Fear of change, fear of truth, fear of Voldemort's return. And so the Ministry chose denial. Cornelius Fudge, the very face of magical authority, refused to acknowledge Voldemort's resurrection, even after seeing the evidence. He called it madness. He's not back, he insisted. In doing so, he condemned more to die. The magical society could not accept that its protections were illusions, so it clung to fantasy, even when fantasy killed. The Triwizard Cup itself, once a symbol of achievement, was transformed into a portkey, a tool of abduction and death. In one moment, a prize became a trap. That shift was not merely a twist of fate, it was poetic justice. The very object that represented glory was used to usher in despair. Magic once again became the means of betrayal. The cup did not lie, it carried truth, and truth hurt. The return of Voldemort was not the moment the world broke. It was the moment it could no longer pretend. The tournament had revealed every weakness, the blind trust in artifacts, the prioritization of image over substance, the readiness to use children for politics, the silence of adults in the face of rising darkness. Cedric's body, laid on the grass of Hogwarts, was not just a victim, it was a monument to every failure the magical world had refused to see. In the days that followed, Harry's cries were met with skepticism. The press mocked him, the Ministry undermined him, but the students had seen enough. Dumbledore, shaken from passivity, began to act. The Order of the Phoenix reformed, but it was not heroism that sparked it. It was tragedy. The tournament had done what 1,000 speeches could not. It had made clear that the magical society was not ready for what was coming, and that unpreparedness had a cost. Looking back, one can see that the 1994 tournament was never about victory. It was a mirror. It reflected fear, arrogance, complacency, and cruelty. It showed that even the noblest intentions, if built on broken foundations, lead to ruin. Hogwarts, the safest place in the world, became the setting for murder. Magic, the pride of wizards, became a tool of manipulation. And unity, the goal of the tournament, was crushed by suspicion and prejudice. There is a reason the Triwizard Tournament was banned for centuries. It was always dangerous. Its revival was not an act of courage, but of hubris. The magical world believed it had mastered the chaos of the past. The tournament reminded them that some fires once lit cannot be controlled, and so, while banners flew and trumpets sounded, a child died, a monster rose, and a society built on illusions began to crumble. In the end, the tournament did not unite schools or cultures. It did not teach bravery or wisdom. It did not crown a true champion. What it did was reveal. It stripped away the comforting lies and exposed the vulnerability of a world too proud to see itself clearly. And perhaps, just perhaps, that revelation, soaked in blood and carried by grief, was the only path forward, not through games, not through cheers, but through awakening. Number 16. Why were there no checks for potions and spells in the tournament? Of all the wonders and horrors of the Triwizard Tournament, one peculiar silence echoes louder than a Hungarian horntail's roar. Amidst the fire and fury of the tasks among dragons and mermaids, mazes and murder, one crucial element was bafflingly absent: oversight. In a competition designed to crown the most capable young witch or wizard of an entire generation, not a single spell was cast to detect foul play. It was an international event with ambassadors, judges, and school heads in attendance, and yet not a single aura or truth charm was applied to prevent cheating. It begs a question that should have alarmed the magical world. Why were the champions never tested for illicit spells, enchanted objects, or potions that might unfairly boost their performance? The lack of any screening or regulatory measures becomes especially disturbing when you consider the stakes, not just the glory of winning, but the mortal danger every champion faced. Dragons could kill, Grindylows could drown, and the maze could drive someone to madness. It was not a playful game, it was a life-threatening trial. And yet, even with lives hanging in the balance, there was no sign of magical scrutiny. The judges seemed more concerned with dramatic flair than fairness or safety. It was as if the show mattered more than the sanctity of the competition. The year 1994, when the tournament returned, after a century-long hiatus, was especially chaotic. Hogwarts hosted it for the first time in over 100 years, and everyone, from Minister Cornelius Fudge to Madame Maxime, seemed focused on pageantry and symbolism. No one asked the obvious: how do we ensure that the contestants aren't using Felix Felicis to slide their way through death-defying challenges, or that their wands aren't laced with dark enchantments, or that they haven't pocketed an invisibility cloak, or worse, a cursed object capable of manipulating outcomes? Even the most basic of checks, like scanning a wand for recent spell history, would have revealed a wealth of information. A simple prior incantato could tell what spells were cast before the task began. A detector of concealment charms could have identified hidden amulets or bewitched clothing. But none of these precautions were ever mentioned, let alone enforced. Not once in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire does a judge or official speak of verifying magical integrity. Dumbledore, usually the beacon of reason, is oddly passive on the matter. Barty Crouch Jr., the supposed enforcer of magical law, appears disinterested in regulation, a fact that becomes painfully ironic given his son's involvement. Bartholomew Crouch Jr., masquerading as Mad-Eye Moody for nearly the entire academic year, freely roamed the castle grounds, tampered with the Goblet of Fire, and placed Harry Potter's name under a fourth school. He accomplished this deception with terrifying ease. He used Polyjuice Potion without detection, bewitched objects without scrutiny, and even imperioused other students. Not a single charm alerted the staff. The ministry, Hogwarts staff, and visiting schools all missed the glaring signs. If that level of infiltration was possible under their noses, what could a motivated competitor have done with just a tiny bottle of Felix Felicis? The Felix Felicis potion, or liquid luck, grants the drinker a day of uncanny success. It is banned in most organized competitions precisely because it makes the impossible look natural. A champion under its influence could dodge dragonfire without meaning to, stumble upon the right path in a maze, or find the golden egg purely by accident. And yet, in the chaos and celebration, not a single tongue tested for its telltale shimmer. No official asked for a sample of each contestant's morning potion routine. In fact, Victor Krum could have drenched himself in it, and no one would have noticed. The more sinister possibility lies in the potential use of potions like the draught of the living death. What if a champion slipped it into a rival's drink during breakfast? What if someone carried a vial of Veritaserum and used it to interrogate competitors for task secrets? The scope for manipulation was limitless, and yet no defensive enchantments surrounded the Great Hall's beverages. There was no magical equivalent of a referee, no boundaries, no whistle to blow when rules were broken, because there were no enforceable rules at all. Then there's the issue of magical artifacts. In a school so paranoid about protective enchantments that staircases moved to prevent access to certain floors, it's strange that the tournament allowed participants to enter tasks with whatever they pleased. Cedric Diggory had a wand and his own talents, sure, But who's to say he didn't have a charmed bracelet of protection? Who's to say Fleur Delacour didn't wear a Veela-enhanced locket to influence judges or competitors? With no inspections, anything was possible, and that's precisely the problem. In the final task, in the maze, that the absurdity reaches its peak. The labyrinth itself was enchanted to test mental strength, magical skill, and physical bravery. But the champions entered alone, unsupervised and unexamined. No one checked their pockets, cloaks, boots, or even their thoughts. The Triwizard Cup had been turned into a portkey, a devastating breach of security that cost Cedric Diggory his life. Had the cup been examined for enchantments, a rudimentary safety protocol, the entire plan would have unraveled. But no one thought to do it. Or perhaps more damningly, no one cared enough to. It wasn't just magical negligence, it was a cultural blind spot. The wizarding world has always had an uneasy relationship with structure. Its education system is lenient, its government clumsy, and its law enforcement spotty at best. But the tournament highlighted this dysfunction on a global stage. Hogwarts was hosting students from Durmstrang and Beauxbatons. Any act of deception could have triggered international scandal, possibly even conflict, and yet they operated the event with less regulation than a classroom duel. When Harry faced the dragon in the first task, he did so with a summoning charm, a solution crafted in secret with no oversight. Who's to say he didn't test 10 dangerous spells on school property during his preparation? No one monitored his spellcasting in the days leading up to the event. No teacher followed him. He could have asked for outside help, brewed a potion, or obtained an illegal object. And he wasn't the only one. Every champion was free to explore options without constraint. In a world where even house elves can access powerful magic, that's not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. Take Victor Krum, for instance, a talented international Quidditch player, but also someone trained at Durmstrang, a school known for its darker curriculum. Who was vetting his magical education? Who confirmed that none of his spells veered into the unethical? When he cursed Fleur in the maze, a moment where he used the Cruciatus curse under the Imperius curse, it didn't even raise a public scandal. No inquiry followed, no disciplinary hearing. The Cruciatus curse, one of the unforgivable curses, was used in a school competition, and it passed almost without comment. And what of the judges themselves? Ludo Bagman, who had a known gambling problem, was one of the tournament officials. His bias toward Harry was obvious and public. He whispered hints, offered help, and showed clear favoritism. In a Muggle competition, this would be grounds for disqualification. In the magical world, it was met with mild amusement. When Karkaroff, a former Death Eater, flinched at the sight of dark magic, it didn't spark concern, it sparked gossip. Barty Crouch Sr., the ministry's representative, spent much of the tournament in a haze of illness, paranoia, and later, magical manipulation. His eventual death at the hands of his own son, disguised via Polyjuice potion, was horrifying, yes. But what's worse is how long it went unnoticed. How does a high-ranking official go missing on school grounds during an international event without triggering alarms? The answer is chilling, because there were no alarms, no detection spells, no surveillance charms. Hogwarts ran the tournament on trust, tradition, and spectacle. Even the Goblet of Fire, the most sacred object in the tournament, was poorly protected. A magical artifact that bound champions to a magical contract should be surrounded by layers of scrutiny. And yet it was easily manipulated by a single, disguised Death Eater. As Barty Crouch Jr. explained in Goblet of Fire, I made sure the goblet would choose Harry Potter's name as a fourth champion. I confused it, bewitched it, made it think there were 4 schools instead of 3. It took him mere weeks to do what an entire staff of educators and officials couldn't undo in a year. The tournament was less a measure of magical merit and more a game of who could outsmart the system, or its total absence. The only real challenge was surviving both the tasks and the incompetence of those in charge. Dumbledore admitted to Harry later, in private, that we all failed to protect you. But the failure wasn't just in guarding Harry. It was in defending the very idea of fairness, justice, and order in magical competition. In the aftermath, the Ministry turned its gaze toward Dumbledore, not because he permitted a fourth champion, but because he revealed Voldemort's return. They missed the forest for the trees. They failed to see that the real scandal wasn't just the portkey or the murder. It was that a global magical event took place with no enforceable rules, no referee, no integrity. The wizarding world, so rich in enchantment, suffers from a fatal weakness. It believes too strongly in its own myth of control. It assumes that because magic is powerful, it is also just. The Triwizard tournament proved otherwise. Without laws, oversight, or even basic supervision, power becomes chaos. And in 1994, chaos wore a tournament badge. Number 17, how did the tournament affect Harry psychologically? Harry Potter emerged from the graveyard with the weight of a world that no child should have ever known. The Triwizard tournament, presented as a game, ended as a waking nightmare. When Harry returned clutching the lifeless body of Cedric Diggory, the gleam of victory meant nothing. What lingered instead was a darkness that had entered through his eyes and lodged somewhere behind his ribs. He wasn't simply traumatized, he was transformed. The tournament marked the moment when innocence bled out of him and fear became a constant companion. Watching Cedric die wasn't merely witnessing a classmate's end, it was an irreversible awakening. Cedric didn't perish in battle or through noble sacrifice. He was murdered, coldly, instantly and meaninglessly. One moment they were standing side by side, the next, kill the spare, and then nothing, a flash of green light and a thud. J.K. Rowling wrote, a swishing noise and a second voice which screeched the words to the night, Avada Kedavra. For Harry, this wasn't just a horror to remember. It was the very first time he saw how casually death could be delivered in the magical world. It rewired something deep in him. No one asked him how it felt to hold Cedric's body. No one asked what it meant to be tied to a tombstone while a man without a nose used his blood to return from near death. No one asked what it did to him to see Peter Pettigrew, the man who betrayed his parents, cut into his own flesh to revive the most terrifying figure in magical history. Instead, the adults gathered around him, patted him on the back, and sent him to sleep. The next morning, the Ministry arrived, not with comfort, but with denial. Cornelius Fudge refused to believe Harry's testimony. Instead of protecting the boy, he publicly ridiculed him. He dismissed the resurrection of Voldemort as fantasy and began a campaign to discredit both Harry and Dumbledore. "He's not back," Fudge insisted. "He's not back. You're all mad." And so began Harry's psychological isolation. The boy who saved countless lives was being painted as a liar. For a 15-year-old still shaking from Cruciatus echoes, this was not just betrayal, it was institutional gaslighting. Psychologically, this denial fractured Harry's perception of adult authority. Until the graveyard, Harry had believed, in the way children must, that adults would eventually intervene when things got too bad, that there would be justice, healing, or at least truth. But the tournament showed him that adults could lie, cower, and manipulate. In Order of the Phoenix, his internal world collapses. "I don't want to be human," Harry roared, and seized Hedwig's empty cage and threw it across the room. This was more than anger, it was despair disguised as rage. Harry's dreams began to change. Nightmares haunted him, not as memories, but as warnings. The graveyard bled into his subconscious with cruel insistence. Voldemort's laughter, Cedric's fall, the red eyes glowing in the dark, all returned nightly, curling into his mind like smoke. And while he woke up gasping, Hogwarts continued on, corridors bustling, students laughing. The disconnect between Harry's trauma and the world's indifference grew cavernous. Even among friends, he grew distant. Ron, who had once doubted him during the Goblet selection, tried to stand by him, but something had cracked between them. Hermione, brilliant and loyal, offered books and theories, but couldn't understand what it was like to see Death's face. When she offered logic, he needed understanding. When she suggested meetings, he needed silence. They were with him, but not in it with him. He was, in every way, alone with his scars. There was no psychological support system in Hogwarts, no counselor, no adult pulling him aside and asking, "What do you need?" Even Dumbledore, wise and warm, remained distant. Out of guilt? Strategy? Fear of getting too close? In Goblet of Fire, Rowling hints at this removal. Dumbledore looked very old now. His face was lined with worry. Yet he offered no comfort. Harry was left to navigate the post-tournament trauma as if it were a secret assignment. The damage rippled through his 5th year. The trauma of the graveyard didn't sit neatly in the past. It shaped his reactions to every moment that followed. His temper became volatile. He snapped at teachers, shouted at friends, isolated himself. The boy who once found solace in Gryffindor camaraderie began pushing people away. He didn't trust their optimism anymore. He didn't believe in promises of safety. When Umbridge arrived, painting smiles over censorship, he saw through it instantly because he'd already seen what denial cost. Rowling captured his mental fracture elegantly in scenes that others read as teenage rebellion, but which were, in truth, signs of complex PTSD. His constant vigilance, quick temper, and sense of impending doom weren't mood swings. They were echoes of the tournament's graveyard. Even his lessons with Snape, brutal, invasive occlumency sessions, only deepened his trauma. Snape, of course, showed no care. He treated Harry's mental wounds as weaknesses to be exploited. Harry's connection to Voldemort, forged through shared blood and pain, became both symbolic and literal. The scar burned not just with prophecy but with dread. Every sharp pain reminded him that the man who killed Cedric was out there, stronger than before, and no one believed him. The Ministry staged campaigns, the Prophet published lies, and Harry bore the burden of knowing the truth. In Order of the Phoenix, he says, "They've got no idea what it's like to be me. No idea." And he was right. What the tournament had awakened in him was the realization that fear was not temporary. It wasn't a moment to be endured and left behind. It was a shadow that lingered, followed him down corridors, breathed behind his ear. He no longer felt safe even in Hogwarts, the place he once called home. Every corner might hold another betrayal. Every silence might be a threat. His trust in the world had fractured, and nothing, not even magic, could repair it quickly. He became hyper-aware of people's expressions, their glances, the way conversations paused when he entered a room. He noticed how students looked at him, some with awe, others with suspicion. Whispers followed him like ghosts. "He's lying," they said. "Wants attention," they muttered. No child should carry the burden of warning an entire world that refuses to listen. No child should be punished for surviving. The most tragic part wasn't just what the tournament did to him. It was how everyone pretended it hadn't happened. Hogwarts returned to its schedules, its meals, its Quidditch matches. The magical world turned its face from the horror and asked Harry to be quiet. Even the Order of the Phoenix, formed to fight Voldemort, often treated Harry like a child unworthy of full truths. He became a symbol, a weapon, a headline, but rarely a boy in pain. He stopped laughing like he used to. The wonder that once filled his eyes at Quidditch, at invisibility cloaks, at moving staircases dulled. The tournament taught him that every magical marvel could be perverted into a tool of terror, the maze with its illusions. The cup turned portkey. The graveyard itself, once a place of remembrance, became a resurrection site for evil. There was no safe magic anymore. Even in his eventual defiance, his leadership of Dumbledore's army, we see a boy trying to reclaim agency, Teaching others wasn't just rebellion, it was therapy. Passing on spells was his way of creating meaning from what he'd endured. If he couldn't undo the tournament, he could at least prepare others. But even then, every lesson, every spell was shaded by the knowledge that spells sometimes failed, that bravery didn't always save the brave. The tournament never ended for Harry. Its final task planted seeds that bloomed into distrust, insomnia, and survivor's guilt. When Sirius died later, it was Cedric's death repeated, a reminder that everyone Harry cared about could be taken without reason. The tournament had taught him that life wasn't fair, and magic wasn't always protection. It was a game whose rules changed, often rigged by the cruel and the cowardly. By the time the wizarding world believed him, it was too late. The damage had been done. The tournament had carved fear into his bones and taught him that the world would look away until it was forced not to. The boy who entered the maze looking for glory emerged from the graveyard with trauma, and no amount of chocolate frogs or house points would ever undo what he saw, what he felt, and what he lost. When future generations read about the Triwizard tournament, they see a list of champions, tasks, and scores. They don't see the shaking hands, the sleepless nights, the sense of betrayal that followed. They don't see a child trying to scream the truth into a world covering its ears. But we, if we look closely, can see the scar the tournament left, not just the lightning bolt on his forehead, but the invisible one that shaped the rest of his life. Number 18. How did the schools change after the tournament? Beauxbatons Academy never truly recovered from the whispering shame that followed Fleur Delacour's return from the Triwizard tournament. In the days after Cedric Diggory's death, French newspapers printed headlines filled with questions, not answers. Comment la sœur de Fleur a-t-elle pu se retrouver en danger de mort? They asked, with increasing urgency. Gabrielle Delacour had been placed under the icy waters of the Black Lake, guarded by Grindylows, as if the younger sibling of a champion was just another object to be retrieved. The people of France, proud and possessive of their magical bloodlines, saw not glory, but negligence. Fleur had dived after her sister with desperation, but failed to rescue her in time, scoring low points. The tournament's organizers had intervened, saving Gabrielle at the last possible moment. But the public asked, what if they hadn't? How could a magical institution, trusted to safeguard the best of their youth, have endangered a child not even enrolled? Fleur's image in France was no longer that of the proud Havre Hope, but of the girl who failed to protect her sister from the cruelty of British traditions. Olympe Maxime, the towering headmistress of Beauxbatons, returned to the south of France with her carriage weighted by more than just enchanted horses. She arrived to a council of worried governors who demanded accountability. While Maxime argued the tournament had been ancient, ceremonial, and supposedly safe, many were unmoved. She had participated not just in a historical tradition, but in a British one, and France resented the tragedy happening on foreign soil. In the years that followed, Beauxbatons quietly declined all invitations to international events held in Britain, and the Academy's curriculum saw subtle but telling changes. Dueling classes were shortened. Dangerous magical creatures were kept strictly in texts, not cages. Field trips were cancelled. A new rule was quietly passed. No siblings of current students could be involved in any magical competition, under any circumstances. Fleur, though once the Academy's pride, would never be mentioned in the halls again without a trace of discomfort. Durmstrang Institute's situation was even more severe. Victor Krum returned as a changed young man. Though under the Imperious curse during the maze task, he had nearly maimed Cedric and attacked Fleur. The magical world knew the truth. Krum had been controlled, but truth often loses to fear. Parents across Eastern Europe began to question the Durmstrang curriculum, famous for its emphasis on combative magic and the dark arts. How could a boy so gifted and noble become a weapon in someone else's hand? Igor Karkaroff, the school's headmaster, had tried to distance himself from the disaster, but the past caught up with him. His Death Eater brand was rediscovered, his loyalty questioned, and his leadership undermined. Only months after the tournament, he vanished, fleeing in fear of Lord Voldemort's return. The school was left leaderless, its corridors filled with suspicion and shame. Without Karkaroff, Durmstrang entered a dark era of instability. The Eastern Confederation of Magical Education imposed oversight. An acting council of elder wizards was installed. Durmstrang's once proud alumni, many of them linked to old and controversial families, withdrew donations and scholarships. The school's remote location, once its greatest strength, became a symbol of secrecy and isolation. Some suspected that other students, not just Krum, had been vulnerable to manipulation. The trust between staff and students broke down, security charms were doubled, occlumency became mandatory. It was a school afraid of its own shadow. At Hogwarts, the mood was no better. While Dumbledore's speech at the end of the year spoke of unity and the need to remember Cedric as a hero, the Ministry had its own version of events. They refused to acknowledge Voldemort's return and condemned Dumbledore's statements as fear-mongering. But public reaction was not so easily tamed. For many parents, it didn't matter whether Cedric had been killed by a dark wizard or an accident. He had died under Hogwarts' watch during a tournament Hogwarts had hosted. A student had perished, and nothing could explain that away. Letters began to flood. McGonagall's office. One mother wrote that she couldn't sleep knowing her son was in a castle where children vanished in mazes. Another threatened to go to the Daily Prophet. The scars of the second task, the sight of children tied beneath the lake, had stirred primal fears in parents. The school had promised them safety, not old-fashioned barbarity masked as tradition. Some parents pulled their children out entirely, others demanded transparency. The Ministry launched an internal inquiry into the Triwizard Tournament's authorization. Barty Crouch Sr.'s name, already tarnished by his son's crimes, was wiped from records in an effort to protect the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Hogwarts was not officially blamed, but the message was clear: no more tournaments, no more games. The Goblet of Fire was removed from the trophy room and locked away. The Triwizard Cup was sent to the Department of Mysteries and never returned. Any mention of reviving the tournament was treated as a joke in poor taste. The students were changed as well. The younger years, who had once idolized Cedric Diggory, now walked past the Hufflepuff table in the Great Hall with somber expressions. Harry Potter, still haunted by the events in the graveyard, became a symbol of something larger, a boy not just famous but cursed. The whispers about him, once full of admiration, turned wary. Some students avoided him altogether, as if afraid that being too close to Harry might make them a target. Others blamed him directly, insisting he had somehow brought danger into their midst. "It's always him," someone was heard saying near the library. "Wherever Harry goes, trouble follows." The house unity Dumbledore had long dreamed of was fractured. Hufflepuff House, mourning Cedric, withdrew into itself. Slytherins grew more cynical, whispering that the school had always favoured Gryffindor bravery over common sense. Ravenclaws began to question the institution altogether. For the first time in years, students formed secret discussion groups, not about magic, but about Hogwarts itself. Was it safe? Was Dumbledore trustworthy? Could the staff protect them when it mattered most? The answers were not comforting. Within the staff, too, the tragedy lingered. Professor Sprout kept a candle burning in the Hufflepuff common room in memory of Cedric. Snape, though as bitter as ever, added advanced counter-curse theory to his NEWT syllabus, citing practical necessity. McGonagall proposed ending House Cup competitions for a year in mourning, though the motion was ultimately denied. Dumbledore became quieter, more introspective. He would sometimes pause mid-sentence in staff meetings, eyes clouded with memory. The weight of the decision to host the tournament hung over him, even as he tried to prepare for the darker war he alone seemed to accept, as inevitable. Outside Hogwarts, the Wizarding World's media had a field day. The Daily Prophet's initial coverage had been sympathetic. A bright star falls, but soon turned skeptical. "Who let this happen?" read one headline. Rita Skeeter, ever opportunistic, published a scathing piece accusing Hogwarts of hiding critical facts. In it, she suggested that the maze had been tampered with days before the final task, and that certain students were given unfair advantages. While much of it was exaggerated, the public didn't care. Scandal had replaced sorrow. The Prophet sold more copies than ever. In France, magical education officials began implementing new safety protocols. Beauxbatons launched a 3-year reform of its competitions and banned external engagements not directly approved by the French Magical Authority. A new position, Ombudsman of Student Protection, was created. Fleur Delacour, for all her grace, found herself struggling in public perception. She took up a position at Gringotts in Britain shortly after, perhaps in part to distance herself from the lingering blame. Her name appeared less and less in French wizarding journals, and when it did, it was usually in footnotes about the failed tournament. Durmstrang, meanwhile, underwent something close to a purge. The school's older instructors, those whose teachings had bordered on the questionable, were dismissed. Karkaroff's sudden flight had revealed cracks long hidden. The Council of Magical Ethics, largely ceremonial before the tournament, began auditing the institute. It was revealed that certain older texts used in Durmstrang classes included instructions for spells banned in most of Europe. The international fallout was swift. Exchange programs were cancelled. Graduates found themselves struggling to find work abroad. Durmstrang, once feared and respected, was now merely feared. Among the alumni of all 3 schools, the scars of the tournament lingered. Roger Davies, who had attended the Yule Ball with Fleur, later admitted in an interview that the atmosphere had never been the same afterward. "It was supposed to be about bringing people together," he said, "but it just reminded us how different we all are and how quickly things can go wrong." Hermione Granger, years later, would write in Hogwarts, a history, revised edition, that the Triwizard tournament's final iteration marked a symbolic end to innocence in magical education. The portrait of Cedric Diggory was added to the Room of Remembrance in the Department of Magical Education, though few students ever visited. His story was included in textbooks, but often summarized in a few short sentences. Killed in the Triwizard tournament, Hufflepuff hero, tragic loss. But those who had been there knew better. They remembered the silence that followed the green flash. They remembered the scream Harry had made. They remembered Dumbledore bending over Cedric's body, whispering something no one else could hear. That memory could not be rewritten. By the time Voldemort's return was publicly acknowledged, the memory of the tournament had already shaped a generation of witches and wizards. The magical world became more cautious. Competitions were now vetted. Insurance policies required for any school event. Even the Quidditch World Cup increased its security protocols. The idea of inter-school cooperation was not abandoned, but it was never again attempted on such a scale. The age of magical romanticism had ended. The age of magical realism had begun. The Goblet of Fire, once revered as an impartial judge, became a symbol of recklessness. In some circles, it was even referred to as the Flame of Folly. A few radical thinkers proposed destroying it altogether, citing the precedent of cursed objects causing institutional ruin, but it was decided instead to keep it locked away, untouched and unnamed, no plaque, no mention, just silence. The Triwizard tournament had once been a celebration of unity, strength, and magical excellence. But in its final form, it had revealed the cracks in the magical world's institutions, cracks that could no longer be ignored. Schools changed, not out of growth, but out of fear. And in that fear lay the true legacy of the tournament. Number 19. Why was no one investigating Barty Crouch Sr.? The legacy of the Triwizard tournament, as told in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, is often reduced to its grand finale, the tragic return of Lord Voldemort and the death of Cedric Diggory. But beneath that haunting memory lies a stranger, quieter omission, a man who stood at the heart of the tournament, who vanished from the stage as abruptly as he had lost control of it. Barty Crouch Sr., once a titan of wizarding lore, had a descent so enigmatic that readers scarcely noticed how quickly his narrative was buried, not by magic, but by deliberate silence. The Ministry of Magic turned its gaze away, and no one seemed to care why. Crouch Sr. was the official in charge of the Triwizard tournament, appointed by the Ministry to oversee the reintroduction of this dangerous and controversial event. It was he who swore to enforce the rules, to ensure the safety of the champions, and to preserve the integrity of the competition. He attended the first task, seated beside Ludo Bagman and Madame Maxime, the emblem of formality and ministry precision. But slowly his behavior began to shift. First it was minor oddities, a stiffness, a strange hesitance in his eyes. Then came his unexplained absences, his failure to attend the Yule Ball, his disappearance from meetings, and finally his deranged appearance in the Forbidden Forest, murmuring gibberish to Harry Potter before being taken away by Alastor Moody. Except that wasn't Alastor Moody, that was Barty Crouch Jr., his own son, wearing the ex-Aura's skin and feeding his father Polyjuice potion while keeping him imprisoned under the Imperious Curse. Yet when the truth emerged, when Harry stood in Dumbledore's office and Crouch Jr. confessed to everything, no official in the ministry paused to examine the implications. No one asked why the man in charge of the entire tournament had gone mad without anyone investigating. No one questioned how a Death Eater had impersonated a professor for almost a year. The ministry simply brushed it under the rug. The irony was cruel. Crouch Sr., once known for his draconian policies against Death Eaters, was undone by the very forces he sought to eradicate. His name had struck fear into the hearts of dark wizards during the First War. He had championed the right to imprison suspects without trial. He had been hailed as the last hope for order in a collapsing society. But his unrelenting rigidity broke his own household. He sentenced his son to Azkaban for being in the company of Death Eaters, despite pleas from his wife, despite the youth's protestations. And when she lay dying, he agreed to switch her with Barty Jr. in secret, a fatal moment of weakness that began the slow unraveling of his life. This tragic irony only deepens the question, why didn't the ministry hold an inquiry? If a man of such stature could fall victim to manipulation and deception under their very noses, shouldn't that have prompted an institutional reckoning? Shouldn't there have been security protocols reviewed, background checks scrutinized, the use of the Imperious Curse studied with renewed urgency? Instead, the scandal disappeared. Crouch Sr.'s death was attributed to mysterious circumstances. Crouch Jr., after spilling everything under Veritaserum, was unceremoniously kissed by a Dementor. No trial, no investigation, no justice. Even Cornelius Fudge, the sitting Minister for Magic, did everything he could to ensure silence. "He's a raving lunatic," he said of Crouch Jr., dismissing Dumbledore's warning. But the dismissal of Crouch Jr. as mad was a deliberate tactic. If his testimony were unreliable, then the entire chain of events could be questioned. Voldemort's return could be ignored. The ministry's failure could be denied. "We must not start a panic," Fudge insisted, more concerned with perception than with truth. So he locked the door on the entire incident. Crouch Sr. conveniently dead, Crouch Jr. conveniently soulless, the tournament a memory to be suppressed. The sheer weight of Crouch Sr.'s authority should have demanded accountability. He wasn't a minor bureaucrat. He had once been considered a potential minister for magic. His decisions had shaped wizarding law for a decade. For someone of his rank to disappear and then be found muttering nonsense in the woods, it was a scandal of the highest order. Yet the wizarding community barely blinked. Perhaps they were too distracted by the tournament. Perhaps they were too eager to move on from Cedric's death. but more likely they were guided by the Ministry's silence, soothed by its false assurances. Mad-Eye Moody's replacement was never properly vetted. Dumbledore, despite his reputation, could not have covered every base. And yet, even when it was revealed that Moody had been missing for months, his real body stuffed into a trunk, there was no outrage from the public, no demands for reform. How had the most paranoid ex-aura in Britain been captured and impersonated without anyone noticing? The answer, as it always seems to be in the Ministry, is discomfort. The truth was too ugly, the failure too damning. So it was buried. It is not merely neglect that makes this fact so haunting, it is deliberate omission. The wizarding world functions on memory and forgetfulness. Scandals disappear as easily as they arrive, replaced by controlled narratives. The Triwizard tournament was supposed to be a symbol of unity, of international cooperation, and restored pride. It ended with a student murdered, a dark wizard reborn, and a ministry that actively denied reality. In such a context, the fate of Crouch Sr. was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. If examined too closely, it would have revealed cracks in every level of the system. The Ministry's full of it, as usual, Sirius Black said bitterly in Order of the Phoenix, summarizing what many knew, but few dared admit. The same Ministry that refused to investigate the Crouch scandal would later smear Harry Potter and Dumbledore as liars. The same Ministry that allowed Barty Crouch Jr. to infiltrate Hogwarts under their nose would persecute students for speaking the truth. Their failure with Crouch Sr. set a precedent, not just for negligence, but for willful blindness. And it began with silence. Even the Daily Prophet, always eager for sensation, did not probe deeper. There were no editorials on Crouch Sr.'s erratic behavior, no exposés on the gaps in tournament security. Instead, the newspaper aligned itself with Fudge's narrative. This was not a failure of leadership, it was a brief interruption in an otherwise successful event. Cedric's death was a tragic accident. Crouch Sr.'s madness, a private tragedy. No more questions asked. But the students at Hogwarts remembered. Harry, Ron, and Hermione saw the signs. They heard the wild ramblings of Crouch in the forest. They knew he was terrified, desperate to get to Dumbledore. They knew he wasn't mad, he was resisting the imperious curse. And yet, when they tried to explain, they were brushed aside. Even Snape, always eager to mock Harry, could not deny that something about Crouch's disappearance stank of deeper rot. It's worth recalling the words of Dumbledore. The truth. It is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution. In the case of Barty Crouch Sr., the Ministry chose caution over beauty, denial over justice. They sacrificed the truth to preserve their illusion of control. They feared what an inquiry might uncover: systemic failures, magical vulnerabilities, and the resurgence of a dark power they had long claimed defeated. There is an eerie parallel between Crouch Sr.'s fate and that of his son. Both were silenced, one by the imperious curse, the other by a Dementor's kiss. Both were tools in a larger deception, and both, in the end, became symbols not of justice, but of suppression. The father's life erased because it revealed too much, the son's soul devoured because he spoke too clearly. The Triwizard tournament was not merely an event, it was a mirror. It reflected the cowardice of a government afraid to confront its own failures. And Bartimius Crouch Sr., with all his rigid ideals and tragic flaws, became its most silent casualty. His name is barely spoken after that year. His story forgotten. But in the shadow of his disappearance lies the truth, that sometimes the most dangerous magic isn't a spell, it's silence. Number 20, what if Harry hadn't saved the other hostages? Of all the moments that defined Harry Potter's character, few were as quietly profound as his decision during the second task of the Triwizard tournament. Beneath the icy surface of the Black Lake, amid eerie silence and the slow drift of magical creatures, Harry faced a test that went far beyond gillyweed or grindylows. He was told to save what was most precious to him, and in the simplest sense, that meant Ron. But Harry, ever led by his heart, saw something no one else did, not just a competition, but a responsibility. And in that moment, he chose to save Gabrielle Delacour, the young sister of Fleur, as well. It was an act that rewrote the task entirely. But what if he hadn't? What if Harry had obeyed the rules, followed instructions, and surfaced with only Ron? What kind of story would we be telling then? The rules of the task were clear. The champions were to rescue their treasures from the lake, treasures being individuals they cared most about. They were to retrieve only one. The illusion, crafted for spectacle and danger, suggested that the hostages were in a sort of suspended magical sleep, completely safe. But the illusion frayed under scrutiny. As Dumbledore later confirmed, the hostages were indeed placed under enchantments that allowed them to breathe and remain unconscious, but there was an underlying truth that made the task much darker. They would not have died, he said, but they could have been harmed. The implication was chilling. Harm, not death. Bruises, trauma, perhaps magical injuries, all still very real possibilities. The moment Harry reached the hostages, the tension was clear. He found Ron, Hermione, Cho, and Gabrielle tied beneath the water like offerings to some ancient deity. Their bodies swayed, eyes closed, expressions neutral, suspended in a watery sleep. The merpeople circled them with tridents in hand, grim and solemn. When Harry attempted to free Gabrielle after cutting Ron loose, the merpeople immediately interfered. They jabbed toward him, shook their heads, and held him back. They were there to enforce the rules. Only the assigned hostage was to be taken. Only what was rightfully his. But to Harry, a child left underwater was not a game piece. It was a human life. Fleur had failed to reach Gabrielle. The task had overwhelmed her, and she was pulled out of the lake before she even reached her sister. From a distance, she watched, panic-stricken, as her sister remained beneath the surface. The fact that she had not made it was no fault of her own, but it left Gabrielle abandoned in the cold depths of the lake. When Harry looked at her small form floating beside Hermione and Cho, he didn't see a competitor's sister. He saw a child who might never wake up if no one acted. And so he acted. The decision was instantaneous, instinctual, and in doing so he exposed the dark flaw in the task's structure. Had Harry obeyed the task's design and left Gabrielle behind, the story might have taken a tragic turn. The tournament was already notorious for its dangers: dragons, drowning, the maze. But a child left underwater by design? That would have cast a shadow over the entire event. Fleur, on discovering that her sister had not been retrieved, would have been devastated. Even if Gabrielle emerged unharmed minutes later, the psychological toll would have been enormous. A 13-year-old girl bound in magical sleep, trapped under meters of dark water, surrounded by spear-bearing merpeople, and ultimately abandoned by both her sister and the system meant to protect her. What's more, the merpeople's resistance wasn't theatrical. Their refusal to let Harry take more than one hostage showed a genuine, even aggressive, intent to maintain control. When Harry persisted, when he threatened them and brandished his wand, they backed off reluctantly. Not out of respect for the tournament, but for Harry's determination. They were following orders, but they were not indifferent. Had no one returned for Gabrielle, would they have kept her guarded for the full hour? Would they have released her safely on their own? Or was their intervention tied strictly to the champion's actions? The book does not say, but the doubt is enough to chill the blood. Gabrielle's fate hinged on Harry's disobedience. That word, disobedience, sounds harsh, but in context it becomes heroism. He knowingly defied the rules because the rules made no moral sense. As he said later, "I wasn't going to leave anyone behind, I just couldn't." His logic was simple and human. He didn't trust the task's structure. He didn't trust that a child's life would be valued less than the scoreboard. He didn't believe that timing and assigned rescue partners could override basic decency, and he was right. Barty Crouch Sr., who was present as one of the judges and at the time under the control of his son through Polyjuice, docked Harry points for being out of time and for attempting to save more than one hostage. It was a clear sign that the task was being judged not on moral grounds, but by rigid competition metrics. Only after the other judges overruled Crouch did Harry receive the praise he deserved. Even Ludo Bagman and Dumbledore themselves intervened to ensure his selflessness was not punished. Bagman gushed that Harry had showed moral fibre, a phrase that, in the context of a deadly tournament, became a rare acknowledgement of character over performance. If Harry had left Gabrielle, the illusion of safety in the task might have crumbled. Her family, Beauxbatons, the wizarding public, all would have seen what the task really was, a dangerously structured simulation where children were used as chess pieces. Gabrielle might have survived, yes, but the emotional damage to Fleur would be irreversible. Her scream when she saw her sister safe on the bank, "Gabrielle, mon Dieu," showed how close she had come to losing her. Remove Harry from that equation, and the outcome becomes unforgivable. The second task, in many ways, was a moral mirror. Each champion revealed something about their character. Victor Krum, who partially transfigured himself into a shark, saved Hermione with efficiency but left the others. Cedric rescued Cho and left the rest without hesitation. Both followed the rules. Fleur tried but failed. Only Harry succeeded in passing a test no one knew was being given, the test of conscience, the test of compassion. He lost points, lost time, and lost breath, but gained something immeasurable. The truth that being a wizard meant more than casting spells. It's easy to imagine another version of that day. Harry cuts Ron free, glances at Gabrielle, hesitates, but obeys the instructions. He swims upward, bursts through the lake's surface to applause, and earns full marks. Gabrielle remains behind. Minutes tick by. No one returns. Murmurs rise among the spectators. Fleur, pale and shaking, begins to scream. The merpeople are confused. They release Gabrielle later, unharmed but scared. The damage is done. The headlines write themselves. Child hostage left behind in magical task. The tournament's prestige takes a hit. Hogwarts' credibility falters. The Ministry of Magic is questioned. And Harry, he remains haunted. But none of that happened, because Harry saw past the task. In his world, the rules weren't absolute. People were. And while others might have considered Gabrielle not his responsibility, Harry made her one. It's the same instinct that made him confront Voldemort at 11 that made him die for his friends at 17. It wasn't just bravery, it was empathy, plain and defiant. There's a line in the book that cements this idea. When the task ends and Dumbledore explains the results, he says of Harry, he demonstrated moral qualities that reveal him to be more than a champion. Not faster, not stronger, more. That word matters. It separates those who play the game from those who change it. Dumbledore had always known that Harry's greatest power wasn't in his wand, but in his heart. Some readers have dismissed the second task as the least dangerous, the most symbolic, but perhaps that's why it mattered most. Physical danger is easy to measure, emotional courage is harder. Harry didn't battle a dragon or face a deadly maze that day. He battled the cold logic of an adult world that had stopped asking if the game was worth the cost. He stood up to the merpeople, the rules, the clock. He said, "This is wrong, this isn't enough." And he acted. Even Fleur, who barely interacted with Harry before the task, was changed by what he did. Her gratitude was immediate and deep. She kissed him on both cheeks and from that point forward treated him with reverence. Not because he won, but because he understood something others didn't, that her sister was not expendable. Looking back, the second task may have been the turning point where Harry's moral compass was put on public display. In the first task he showed ingenuity. In the third, endurance. But only in the second did he show this specific kind of strength, the willingness to lose a game to save a girl he barely knew. That kind of decision makes a man not just a champion. That kind of decision is why Harry is the boy who lived. The alternative, the what if, reminds us that heroism isn't about who wins, but about who refuses to let others lose. Harry could have surfaced to glory, but instead he swam a little deeper, and in that cold, dark lake he pulled the truth into the light. Number 21. Why did the judges score as if they didn't care? Of all the peculiarities that haunted the Triwizard tournament, perhaps none felt more quietly unsettling than the scoring system itself. Beneath the shimmering grandeur of dragons, underwater rescues, and hedge mazes that whispered threats in the dark, there lay a foundation so unstable it seemed almost surreal in hindsight. The very mechanism that should have ensured fairness, objective scoring by a panel of esteemed judges, functioned more like a rigged carnival game. The audience was dazzled by fire and foam, but few paused to consider how arbitrary the points were, or how little the scores reflected actual merit. In the first task, Harry Potter, a 14-year-old who wasn't even supposed to be competing, found himself face to face with a Hungarian horntail, the most dangerous of all dragons. His broomstick maneuver, summoning the firebolt and weaving through jagged rocks under the dragon's claws, was reckless and near suicidal. But it worked. He retrieved the golden egg with daring and just enough grace to impress the crowd. Yet, when the points were tallied, something felt off. Harry received 40 out of 50 points, the same as Victor Krum, but Krum hadn't risked nearly as much. He had used a clean conjunctivitis curse, causing minimal fuss and only slightly injuring the dragon's eye. It was neat, it was efficient, it was safe, and it was awarded equally. Barty Crouch Sr., outwardly cold and mechanical, gave Harry a high score. His sense of order dictated that bravery be rewarded. Madame Maxime, likely calculating Beaubaton's odds, offered a middling score. Ludo Bagman, ever the showman, practically erupted with enthusiasm, rewarding Harry's thrilling performance. But Igor Karkaroff, the head of Durmstrang and a known loyalist to Victor Krum, awarded him a meagre score. This wasn't a matter of opinion, it was a pattern. 10, he said for Krum, practically glowing with pride, and for Harry, 4. No explanation, no logic, just thinly veiled favoritism, and no one did a thing. The other judges exchanged looks, but no formal complaint was filed. Dumbledore, who so often played the quiet guardian of fairness, didn't contest the obvious bias. In a moment where leadership could have spoken truth, silence prevailed. It was as if the absurdity of the system was a known secret everyone had agreed to ignore. After all, as Bagman cheered and the crowd roared, who would bother dissecting the numbers? The show had to go on. In the second task, this tendency for careless scoring became even more glaring. The champions were required to rescue someone they valued from the depths of the Black Lake. Harry, diving into freezing water aided only by gillyweed, encountered Grindylows, merpeople, and his own fear. He reached the hostages first. He found Ron, but also saw Gabrielle Delacour, Fleur's little sister, unattended. Fleur had been attacked by Grindylows and never made it to the finish. Harry, true to his character, stayed behind, waiting until the hour was nearly up, and tried to rescue both hostages. He was warned, but ignored it. He wouldn't leave a child behind. He emerged last, but with Ron and Gabrielle in tow. His noble instincts had slowed him down. In terms of task completion, he had technically failed. He was late, but morally he had triumphed. Most of the judges, the book reads, gave him high marks for moral fibre. Still he scored 45 points. Victor Krum, who used transfiguration to turn partially into a shark and brought Hermione up early, received 47. Cedric Diggory, who arrived first and rescued Cho Chang, earned the full 50. Yet none had demonstrated the same level of risk, compassion, or self-sacrifice as Harry. It wasn't about who showed the most courage or integrity. It was about appearances. Cedric arrived first, so he got top marks. Krum brought back his hostage with efficiency. Harry, who defied the system to do what was right, was penalized. The judges acknowledged his virtue, but then buried it beneath numerical discipline. The scores didn't reflect moral greatness. They reflected how cleanly someone fit into the structure of the challenge. And as for Karkaroff, once again, he gave Harry a low score. A paltry 4, no reason. Just contempt. And again, no one questioned it. One cannot forget that Karkaroff was a former Death Eater, a man who had betrayed his own to avoid Azkaban, and who viewed Harry as a symbol of everything that threatened his world. His bias was more than national, it was ideological. But what about the others? What excuse did they have for allowing such a mockery of fairness to continue? Perhaps Dumbledore was too focused on the tournament's broader implications, or on the mystery of Harry's inclusion. Perhaps Crouch was too distracted by his polyjuiced impostor of a son. But the result was the same, a tournament that looked fair but wasn't. The third task, arguably the most dangerous, was a final nail in the coffin of any notion that the scoring system was designed to reward excellence. By the time the maze challenge arrived, the cumulative points placed Harry and Cedric nearly tied, which meant they would enter the labyrinth together. But who remembers the exact tally? Who could defend why Krum had more points than Harry after a second task in which he saved one person and stunned another champion? Who decided how many points justified a 5-second advantage? The entire structure was porous, arbitrary. It existed more as a theatrical frame than as a real measure of merit. Inside the maze, Krum was imperious. Fleur was attacked. Harry and Cedric fought their way through enchanted hedges, riddles, and unseen terrors. When they reached the cup together, Harry insisted they both take it. It was the final heroic act in a series of morally upright choices. But none of that mattered in the end. The Triwizard Cup was a portkey to a graveyard. Cedric died, Voldemort returned, and the scores utterly irrelevant. Looking back, the entire point system seems not just flawed but meaningless. It gave the illusion of order while chaos ruled underneath. The audience clapped for numbers that had no grounding in reason. The ministry officials nodded at scoreboards that told lies, and the champions, brilliant and brave, were pushed through a grinder designed more for spectacle than justice. Harry's journey through the tournament wasn't about points. It was about survival, truth, and resistance. But the judges' behavior told a different story. To them, it was a game. Bagman treated it like Quidditch. Karkaroff used it as a political tool. Madame Maxime tried to preserve her school's dignity. Only Dumbledore seemed to grasp the deeper current of darkness beneath the surface, yet even he did not interfere with the scoring system that failed Harry time and again. It would be easy to chalk all this up to the incompetence of wizarding bureaucracy, but it's deeper than that. The scoring system was never designed to be fair. It was designed to entertain. In a world where dragons and curses fly, where life and death hang on the tip of a wand, the judges sat comfortably and assigned numbers to courage. The very idea feels grotesque in retrospect. What does it say about the magical world that no one questioned this? That no one stood up and said, "This isn't justice"? Even when the favoritism was blatant, as with Karkaroff's ridiculous scores, the rest simply moved on. Perhaps it's a reflection of a larger malaise, a culture that values tradition over truth, ceremony over scrutiny. The most chilling part is how easily everyone accepted it. Even Harry, though annoyed by Karkaroff's bias, never demanded fairness. He was too preoccupied with staying alive. The audience was too thrilled by the fireworks, and the judges, wrapped in velvet and self-importance, smiled and wrote numbers on little pieces of parchment. When the tournament ended, the scores vanished from memory. No one talked about them. The tragedy of Cedric Diggory's death swallowed every other narrative. But the seeds of corruption had long been planted. In a competition meant to unite schools and foster respect, the scoring turned it into a carnival, and no one stopped the ride. The Triwizard tournament, in its return after decades of absence, revealed not the strength of magical unity, but its fragility. The way the judges scored the tasks, arbitrary, biased, unexplained, was more than just a quirk. It was a symptom, a symbol, an echo of the same blindness that would later allow the Ministry to deny Voldemort's return, smear Dumbledore, and persecute Harry. Every scorecard written by Karkaroff was a warning. Every inflated mark from Bagman was a distraction. Every quiet acceptance from the others was complicity. The tournament was a stage, and the scores were props. Behind them, the real drama unfolded, darker, heavier, and far more consequential than any number on a judge's card. Number 22. Why didn't anyone suspect Moody? Alastor Moody was a name that evoked fear in dark wizards and respect among the ranks of the Aurors, a man whose paranoia was legendary, who would never drink from a glass he hadn't filled himself, who installed 7 locks on a door and still slept with one eye open literally. And yet in Harry Potter's 4th year at Hogwarts, that same Moody appeared transformed. He was suddenly genial, even chatty, offering young Harry guidance and confidence boosts, taking an unusual interest in his well-being. This should have sent a chill down the spine of anyone who had known him. But it didn't. No one questioned it. No one stopped to wonder why the notoriously antisocial, deeply mistrustful former Auror was suddenly embracing the role of mentor to a 14-year-old student. This shift in personality was not subtle. Moody's sudden involvement in student affairs, his participation in casual school activities, and even his interactions with the staff were in stark contrast to the real man's well-established history. The true Alastor Moody, gruff, abrupt, reclusive, was not a teacher by nature. His world had been battlefields and blood, not classrooms and cauldrons, yet the entire faculty, including Dumbledore himself, seemed content to accept this new version without so much as a questioning glance. Dumbledore, who had once called Moody the most capable Auror the Ministry ever had, failed to notice the radical shift in his old friend's demeanour. The man walking the halls in Moody's name was in fact Barty Crouch Jr., a convicted Death Eater, presumed dead. He kept the real Moody locked in a magical trunk in a compartment at the bottom, kept alive just enough to harvest strands of hair for his daily dose of polyjuice potion. And this deception endured for an entire academic year. Crouch Jr., playing the part with meticulous care, took the potion every hour, never missing a dose, all while residing in one of the most secure magical institutions in the world, that no one uncovered. This elaborate masquerade speaks volumes not only of Crouch's cunning, but of Hogwarts' staggering complacency. Even the sensory details failed to alert anyone. Polyjuice potion, by its very nature, is repulsive. It smells of rotten cabbage, a stench that lingers and stains. Hogwarts, where even a minor mishap in potions class can trigger instant inquiry, somehow failed to investigate the persistent foul odour that must have trailed behind Moody. The staff, accustomed to investigating rule breakers and secret corridor usage, never once thought to ask why one of their own seemed to reek of decay. The olfactory evidence alone should have sparked suspicion, especially from someone like Professor Snape, who prided himself on an acute sensitivity to potion ingredients and their residue. And then there was Hermione Granger, arguably the brightest student of her generation, who could sense irregularities in people with surgical precision. This was the girl who suspected Lupin of being a werewolf in her 3rd year, simply by observing his absences and the presence of wolfsbane. And yet, she never once questioned why Moody would champion Harry so enthusiastically. Moody's favoritism was blatant. He gave Harry a leg up in the Triwizard tournament, taught him powerful spells like the unforgivable curses, even broke school norms to prepare him for tasks. This behavior was out of character for a man known to mistrust nearly everyone, but Hermione never raised an eyebrow. nor did she find it strange that Polyjuice potion was being brewed in secret, something she had herself used in second year, and knew well the dangers and smells associated with it. The faculty's silence was perhaps most damning. Minerva McGonagall, ever vigilant, ever strict, had an instinct for trouble and had never shied from confronting it. She had questioned Dumbledore's choices before, over Harry's safety, over Quidditch interference, over Dolores Umbridge's appointment. Yet she never questioned Moody's increasingly bizarre behaviour, his interference in a school competition, or his enthusiastic approval of Harry's illegal entry into the Triwizard tournament. McGonagall, who once barked at Peeves for vandalism and wept silently at Cedric's death, remained oddly detached from Moody's obvious violations. The house elves in the kitchens must have noticed the constant replenishing of odd ingredients, boomslang skin, lacewing flies, and most crucially, a near-endless supply of pumpkin juice that only one person refused to drink. Dobby, for instance, could spot subterfuge in a sock. How did these creatures, who overheard gossip, moved invisibly, and obeyed every command, not report anything strange? In a castle, alive with whispers, why did none reach Dumbledore's ears? Dumbledore's failure is perhaps the most inexplicable. He had known Moody for decades, had fought beside him in wars, had invited him personally to Hogwarts. And yet even he did not perceive the radical difference in temperament, the warmth, the sociability, the strange calculated guidance offered to Harry. The real Moody was never a mentor, he was a soldier. But Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, saw only what he wanted to see, a comrade guarding his students. When Barty Crouch Jr. was finally unmasked, Dumbledore admitted, "We were all deceived." But that admission raises more questions than it answers. Snape, the master of suspicion, also missed the signs. The man who had once told Harry, "You have a habit of walking into danger," failed to recognize that danger was walking beside them every day, masquerading as their colleague. Snape had been brewing potions for decades, and Polyjuice, with its unmistakable composition, should have been easily traceable to his trained nose. He also hated Moody, loathed him in fact, and yet never challenged his odd behaviours, never reported him to Dumbledore, never took it upon himself to investigate the source of the stench wafting from Moody's quarters. There's a certain irony in the fact that the only person who ever seemed uncomfortable with Moody was Draco Malfoy. He voiced his suspicions early on, but they were dismissed as adolescent spite. The Slytherin heir, often maligned for his sneering and posturing, may have been the only student who instinctively sensed something off. He complained about Moody's favoritism and unorthodox methods, but of course, no one listened to Draco Malfoy. Hogwarts had become so comfortable in its routines that it had lost its instinct for vigilance. The very institution that prided itself on magical defences, moving staircases, hidden rooms, enchanted portraits, had allowed a Death Eater to live among its students, teach them, and influence a major international competition. It wasn't merely that Crouch Jr. was clever, it was that everyone else was blind, or perhaps more accurately, willfully blind, because acknowledging discomfort, questioning authority, and confronting inconsistencies requires courage. And in that year, Hogwarts was sorely lacking in that kind of bravery. One might argue that Barty Crouch Jr. was a master of disguise, that he studied Moody's every tick, mimicked his speech, and even fooled the magical eye. But Polyjuice Potion cannot replicate soul, it cannot imitate moral compass or core personality. And the fake Moody, while convincing in posture and vocabulary, betrayed his mask in subtle ways, his calculated helpfulness, his obsession with Harry's victory, and his almost fanatical push to see him reach the graveyard. These were not Moody's goals, these were a Death Eater's ambitions, veiled in feigned mentorship. Fred and George Weasley, with their natural skepticism and love for mischief, didn't question Moody either. They, who could detect Umbridge's insincerity within days, who later orchestrated a grand escape from her regime, did not suspect the professor, who clearly had his own agenda. It's not that they lacked intelligence, it's that they, like everyone else, trusted the idea of Moody more than the man himself. The failure to detect the impostor casts a dark shadow not only on the faculty, but on the institution of magical governance as a whole. The Ministry of Magic, which had sent someone to Hogwarts under the guise of improving international relations, did not verify his identity beyond a name. No magical safeguard, no identity confirmation, no inquiry into behavior changes. A simple "Alas, Moody is here" was sufficient to lull everyone into a false sense of security. And then there's the most tragic part of all. The children, the students of Hogwarts, had placed their trust in a man who did not exist. Harry, in particular, viewed Moody as a protector, a teacher who believed in him when no one else did. He absorbed his lessons, respected his experience, and leaned on his guidance. To discover that this figure of strength was actually a puppet of Voldemort's design was more than a betrayal. It was an erosion of trust in the very institution meant to keep him safe. The Triwizard tournament was designed to showcase skill, courage, and international unity. But under the false Moody's influence, it became a stage for manipulation. Tasks were twisted in Harry's favor, clues were handed to him, tools were conveniently placed in his path. This was not a fair contest. It was a trap meticulously orchestrated under everyone's noses, and it succeeded because no one thought to question why a teacher would meddle so thoroughly in a student's path to glory. The magical trunk in which the real Moody was imprisoned had 7 compartments. 7. In a castle where students once uncovered a hidden stone guarded by a 3-headed dog, no one thought to examine the luggage of a man who behaved strangely, smelled awful, and brewed potions in secret. The Marauder's map, which revealed every name and movement in the castle, was in Harry's possession that year. And yet it was never used to verify Moody's location. One glance at the map would have shown 2 names, Alas, Moody and Barty Crouch Jr., at the same time, one in the trunk, one in the classroom, but no one looked. And so, Hogwarts marched forward under a comfortable illusion, blind to the quiet horror unfolding in its own corridors. The deception was flawless, not because it was undetectable, but because it went undetected, because those who should have asked questions didn't, because a culture of blind faith and hierarchy dulled the sharp edge of suspicion, and in the end, Cedric Diggory died, Harry was nearly destroyed, and Voldemort returned, not despite the school's protections, but because of them. Number 23, the tournament as a convenient cover for a conspiracy. The Triwizard tournament dazzled with fire and water, glory and grief, but beneath its glimmering surface, the true spectacle remained unseen by nearly everyone. It was never truly about uniting schools, fostering magical camaraderie, or watching young champions prove their mettle. Instead, the tournament served a darker, far more deliberate purpose. It was the ideal cover for Lord Voldemort's meticulous plan. While the audience gawked at dragons and mazes, a far more sinister drama unfolded, one in which Harry Potter, unknowingly, walked a path paved by his enemy, inching closer and closer to a graveyard designed for resurrection, not competition. Dumbledore had always been careful, watching over Harry like a silent guardian. Yet even he was drawn into the dazzling distractions of the tournament. His trust in Barty Crouch Sr. and his apparent willingness to allow international participation opened Hogwarts to forces he could not control. The school was transformed into a revolving stage, hosting foreign delegations, journalists, and spectators. In that chaos, the safeguards around Harry were stripped away. The illusion of celebration provided just enough noise to silence the warning bells. Barty Crouch Jr. wore the perfect disguise. With the stolen visage of Alas, Moody, he entered the castle as a protector. But it was all theatre. Every lesson he gave, every piece of advice he offered to Harry, every seemingly accidental moment, it was all rehearsal for the final act. Even his assistance during the unforgivable curses lesson was an investment in manipulation. "You need to know what you're up against," he had said, his false concern masking the calculation beneath. He wasn't preparing Harry for survival, he was grooming him for sacrifice. From the very beginning, Harry's inclusion in the tournament defied logic. He was underage, underprotected, and under pressure. Yet no one questioned the Goblet of Fire's decision deeply enough. "He is a champion," Dumbledore had declared, and the school obeyed. It was a moment of manufactured inevitability. By invoking a magical contract, Crouch Jr. ensured that Harry would remain on course. The goblet became the first of many traps disguised as destiny. Once committed, Harry's participation couldn't be reversed, not by Dumbledore, not by the Ministry, not even by himself. And so the stages were set. Dragons, mermaids, and a maze. But none of them were truly the point. They were breadcrumbs scattered through the forest to distract every eye, every mind. The first task, a confrontation with a Hungarian horntail, was dangerous but survivable. It offered spectacle, not substance. It allowed Crouch Jr. to encourage Harry's ingenuity, feeding him the idea of flying, subtly grooming him to believe in his own resourcefulness. "Play to your strengths," the impostor said, pushing Harry closer to the kind of confidence that could be easily manipulated. The second task seemed even more benevolent, a mission to rescue a friend from the depths of the Black Lake. But even that held significance. The hostages weren't truly in danger, but the emotional manipulation was real. Harry's empathy became a tool, his need to protect others, to save not just Ron but Gabrielle Delacour, marked him as the kind of person who could be drawn into a trap if a life appeared to hang in the balance. Crouch Jr. learned everything he needed about Harry's instincts. The tournament became a surveillance operation cloaked in gold. Between the tasks, Crouch Jr., still in his Mad-Eye guise, kept close to Harry. He ensured no one else got too near. "Constant vigilance," he repeated like a mantra, preaching caution while orchestrating deceit. Not even Severus Snape, whose instincts were sharper than most, saw through the fog. Snape distrusted Moody, but not enough. His eyes were elsewhere, on Karkaroff, on Draco Malfoy, on the signs of dark magic returning, but not on the teacher who walked the halls every day, plotting resurrection. It was all a grand diversion. The Triwizard tournament consumed the castle, its students, and its staff. Rita Skeeter's venomous articles kept everyone's attention on gossip and scandal. "The boy who lies?" she suggested, feeding doubt into the public eye. The press, the fans, the spectacle, it all contributed to Harry's isolation. With each passing task, he stood more alone. And isolation, Voldemort knew, was the first step toward control. The final task was the culmination of it all. A sprawling hedge maze was grown on the Quidditch pitch, walls alive, branches shifting. It wasn't meant to be won, it was meant to swallow. "The maze will be different from the other tasks," Dumbledore had warned. "You will face obstacles." But no one imagined that the real danger waited at the center, not within the maze, but beyond it. When Harry and Cedric touched the cup, they didn't claim victory, they triggered the climax of a ritual that had been building in secret for months. In that graveyard, Harry met Tom Riddle not as a memory or a whisper, but in the flesh. Voldemort's plan had worked flawlessly. Bone of the father, unknowingly given, flesh of the servant, willingly sacrificed, blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. The spell that returned the Dark Lord to power required very specific ingredients. The tournament delivered them. Harry's blood, symbolic and literal, became the final key. The Triwizard Cup was a portkey. The entire event had been a pretext for the moment Voldemort could touch him again. The most chilling detail? The plan didn't require anyone to believe. In fact, disbelief was part of the strategy. When Harry returned, carrying Cedric's body, shouting of Death Eaters and Voldemort's rebirth, he was met with suspicion. Cornelius Fudge refused to accept the truth. The tournament ended not with a celebration, but with a funeral and denial. "He's back," Harry had whispered. But the world looked away. The tournament, with all its glamour and glory, had provided a story too shiny for truth to pierce. Even among allies the damage was done. Dumbledore rallied the Order. Snape returned to his old loyalties, but the delay cost them time. The Ministry's refusal to act allowed Voldemort to move in the shadows. He had risen again in full strength, and the world believed the tournament had simply gone tragically wrong. But it hadn't gone wrong. It had gone exactly as planned. Crouch Jr. was unmasked, but not before the damage was complete. His role in the resurrection of the Dark Lord was confirmed, but the tournament had given him months of unfettered access to Harry, the castle, and the people needed for his master's return. His imprisonment was a hollow victory. The real game had already been played, and it had ended with Voldemort reborn. The irony was bitter. The tournament, intended to unite magical youth, had instead ushered in the return of darkness. The magical contract that bound Harry to the competition had also bound him to fate. Every moment of fear, every triumphant cheer, every turn of the maze was a step deeper into a web designed by someone who never once stepped foot into the castle. Crouch Jr. had orchestrated the perfect illusion. While Fleur worried about her sister, Krum was imperious into attacking Cedric, and Harry wrestled with fear. The real battle happened unnoticed. Hogwarts, the safest place in the world, became a theatre. The audience was the school. The actors were the champions. The script had been written by a man with red eyes and no soul. Even the pensive could not undo what had been done. Dumbledore's memories revealed too late the pieces of the puzzle. "It is happening again," he had whispered after the third task. But by then it had already happened. The tournament had served its purpose to distract, divide, and deliver. Voldemort had not just returned. He had used the machinery of the magical world's traditions to do so publicly and without suspicion. In hindsight, the clues are blinding. The false Moody's obsession with fairness, his nudging of Harry toward victory, the way the cup was placed in the maze, all of it aligned with surgical precision. This was no improvisation, it was choreography. Every step Harry took was watched. Every decision was shaped. The freedom he thought he had was a mirror trick. The tournament had only one true champion, and it wasn't Cedric Diggory, it was Voldemort, and so the truth lingers like smoke after a duel. The Triwizard tournament was never about bravery or honor. It was a distraction, a glamorous sleight of hand in a war of shadows. And in that year, the enemy won not with curses, but with a cup.